Welcome, everyone. My name is Olle Fredin. Some of you know me. I'm part of Sasnet, and I'm also a lecturer in sociology over there. This lecture is part of a lecture series organized by Sasnet. It relates to contemporary transformations in South Asia, and specifically urbanization. And we are very happy to have David Satterthwaite here today. David is a senior fellow at IIED, and he's also a visiting professor at the Development Planning Unit, University College London. He's one of the most prominent scholars in the field of urbanization and international development. And he's also a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. He's recently co-authored a book together with Diana Mitlin on urban poverty in the Global South. And he's also the author of a forthcoming book with the same co-author called Reducing Urban Poverty in the Global South. And as I mentioned, this is the first in a lecture. This is the first lecture in a whole series of lectures, and I just want to say that the next lecture will be held on the 13th of November, and our speaker will be Ursula Rao, and I'll say more about that after this lecture. So now I'll give the word to David, and again, I just want to repeat that we're really, really happy to have you here. Please, David.
Cities that are responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions. This was rather a nice study in Toronto that looked at 4 different areas in Toronto and looked at the greenhouse gas emissions per person from transport and housing. And normally you'd look at that and say, oh, the sprawling distant suburb must be the rich area and the dense inner city area must be the poor area. But that's not the case. This is showing that a dense inner city area, which was desirable, people liked living there, where there were lots of facilities available, walking and bicycling, with high density apartments that met high standards of insulation, allowed those people in Toronto to exist below the 2 tonnes per person per year guideline, whereas the people in the distant suburb were enormously over the 2 tonnes per person per year guideline. So clearly it's not all cities, and clearly it's not everyone in a city. Low-income groups generally have much lower greenhouse gas emissions per person. And there's many cities with very low emissions. The cities with half a tonne per person per year, or 0.1 tonnes per person per year. The only trouble is that they're emitting so little because there's such poverty, there's such low consumption. And what we finally come to is it's not cities that's driving climate change. It's not rich people in cities that are driving climate change. It's high consumption lifestyles, most of which are in urban areas, that are driving climate change. And that's an important distinction. If we look at what's driven the increase in emissions over the last 30 to 40 years, it isn't places where populations are growing. It's places actually where population growth is declining rapidly, but consumption is growing very rapidly. So 1950 to the present, China has made an enormous contribution to increases in greenhouse gas emissions, as its population growth slowed and slowed and slowed. Africa has made almost no contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, about 3%. Yet during that period, its population was growing rapidly. So it's not the number of people, and it's not the cities, it's the number of people with high consumption lifestyles that drives climate change. And a proportion of those are in urban areas. This begins to make it complicated to actually calculate this. Sometimes a city can appear to be very good on greenhouse gas emissions because it's getting all its electricity from nuclear power or from hydro. Or, like my city, London. London looks to have a low greenhouse gas emissions per person. If you take the London boundaries and you add up all the emissions, it comes to about 6 tonnes per person per year. Not great, but not like Denver or Stuttgart. But if you change the way it's calculated, you change it so it's the greenhouse gas emissions generated by Londoners, including me coming to Lund and the generation with the airplane here, it changes the picture completely. London generates 12 tons per person per year. And the reason that some of the Chinese cities back here appeared so high is that they're manufacturing many goods that then come to Europe or North America. And so if you begin to allocate, instead of allocating the fridge made in Shenzhen to China, you allocate the fridge to New York because it was a New Yorker that bought it. It begins to change the whole picture of responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. Someone very proud of their Prius. I drive a clean car, but the extent to which a Prius is actually ecologically sound depends on whether the electricity comes from renewable sources or coal-fired power stations. So do we count emissions from within urban boundaries, or do we count emissions based on the consumption of urban dwellers? The trouble is there's very little data on greenhouse gas emissions for most low-income nations. And there's actually very little data on greenhouse gas emissions other than carbon dioxide. And there's other greenhouse gas emissions that have huge importance, methane, chlorofluorocarbons among them. Okay, that's uncovered. But if most of the growth in population is going to be, in urban population is going to be in Africa, Asia, and a little bit in Latin America, it's what cities they create that's going to determine, to a large extent, how much they generate greenhouse gas emissions. And I don't know how many of you know Dar es Salaam, but Dar es Salaam is a city I love. It's a laid-back city. You get fantastic food, some of the best hot Zaire jazz, mainly because people from the Congo have moved there because it's safer. And it's a low-density city. 80% of the population in informal settlements, 10% served with sewers, maybe 20% with decent water supply systems. So a city with a huge need for investment in water and sanitation and drainage and healthcare and schools. And what do? They produce master plans like this, which are absolute nonsense, which will take all the money that's available for investment to create unsustainable towers. What's even worse is that they sometimes term this an eco-city. Yet on every criteria I know for judging an eco-city, this fails dramatically. And here is an eco-lodge in Vietnam, which includes organic vegetables, on-site kitchen garden, recycling and solar power. It sells itself as an ecological holiday. But you've got to fly to Vietnam to enjoy this holiday, and then you've got to take a boat to get to this place, and then you've got to pay over 250 quid a night. Now this is the fundamentally unsustainable, unecological tourism that's masquerading as ecotourism.
Nice.
This is a sadder story. This is BedZ, the Beddington Zero Energy Development. And this is a super residential development. They did everything so carefully. They tried to assess the embedded carbon in the materials that they used to build. They built to very high energy efficiency. It's a mixed income community, so it isn't just concentrating wealthy people. So the energy they did really well on. The only trouble is that when they did an evaluation of what people spent their money on, their energy bill had gone down so much that they were all going to Spain for their holidays. So you begin to get to see that getting a reduced pull on the planetary resources needs more than very efficient housing and very efficient transport. It's also around decisions that we have to make about our consumption. I'm now going to show you the world's most efficient eco-city, and has very low greenhouse gas emissions.
What is this place, BedZ?
BedZ is in London.
What's London?
In London. We do a few things right in London, not many. And so here is the most ecologically beneficial city on the planet. Low greenhouse gas emissions, lots of prosperity, lots of innovation, amazingly low resource use, maximizing waste reuse and recycling, a very compact city. So So there's very little loss of forest or agricultural land. Almost all the trips are made by walking or bicycling. And the diets are predominantly vegetarian, so they're not very energy intensive. Very high levels of waste use and recycling. Renewable energy for sharpening all your kitchen implements. As an energy specialist told me, ATP was powering this, the energy that is in the human body. This is a local bakery that's very popular. I actually often go here for breakfast. And you've got a delivery service for this excellent bakery using a bicycle. Dense city, compact city, very compact city. This is Dharavi, some of you would probably have gathered. This is this amazing informal settlement in the middle of Mumbai, now in a very central location, originally developed on the periphery of Mumbai. And around 400,000 inhabitants, most of them working in Dharavi. $400 million worth of business activities a year. And with, you know, the retail services that you would expect of a city of 400,000. And some unusual business opportunities. There's now a thriving business of doing slum tours for visitors to India, not usually involving the inhabitants. Incredible productivity. This is Mumbai has long been famous for its pottery, going back 50, even maybe 100 years. Local foods, global links, ideal trading company, exporters, importers, manufacturers of animal byproducts, foodstuffs and garments. Very sophisticated technology in some parts of Dharavi, and very old technology in other parts. This is one of the wider streets in Dharavi. You see the ladders. What happens is that one family will live on the ground floor, another will live on the second floor, and sometimes they'll even construct a third floor. Almost everyone living with one room, and sometimes a mezzanine, which kind of gives them a little bit more space. Cheapest accommodation in Mumbai. Families who move with construction work. Supermarket. Private doctors practice in Dharavi. All sorts of services. Open space as a workplace, making garlands, doing your cooking, doing your laundry, a place to do homework, a place to gossip, a place to chat. And then the amazing recycling. Nothing gets wasted in Dharavi. Absolutely nothing gets wasted. Processes a large part of the waste from Mumbai, with enormously valuable consequences for the city economy and the city ecology. Here are syringes being cleaned, and they're made into dispensers for cheap sweets. There's a warehouse with a different recycled material. Okay, so you've got 400,000 people in 2 square kilometers. That means that you could fit 2 billion new urban dwellers in Dharavis in the county of Lund. As I understand it, I don't know how to pronounce it, Skåne? Skåne, thank you. Skåne County is about 10,000 square kilometers, right? And if you do the maths, you can actually fit 2 billion people into the county. Now, it's a silly example, but it's an example that reminds us that compact cities don't take up all that much space. There isn't that much of a conflict between rural and urban land. Where there's a conflict is where urban centres sprawl and where speculative real estate agents move in and buy up agricultural land and fail to develop it because they're waiting for the speculative profits. And I don't have any figures for greenhouse gas emissions for Dharavi, but my guess is that they're negative. Because if you charge people for their consumption, you should then do the reverse for when they collect materials and separate them and turn them back into production systems. So Dharavi may have a a negative contribution to global warming. And of course, vegetarian diets are cheaper, so that's why the vegetarian diet is so predominant, as well as also being chosen by many people. But there's one toilet for 1,000 people. These are the water pipes and the main waste canal. It was a funny story. The Deputy Governor of the Bank of England came to visit Dharavi, and I was there. And so I tagged along for the ride. And she'd been told to come in a small car because you couldn't turn anything big around. And she came in a 12-seater with these enormous security guards. And she was a woman. But everywhere we went in Dharavi, they looked at me as the man and thought, oh, he must be the governor, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. So I got all the garlands. And I had to keep saying, no. It's her that gets the garlands. Very embarrassing. And we almost dropped her in this because trying to turn the 12-seater in this tiny lane was almost impossible. And, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, this, I think you wouldn't drown, you'd dissolve. And Dharavi floods very seriously, largely because there's been no attention to the flooding. The blue bits down below show where the flooding is usually most intense. So you have very good ecological performance, but very poor on environmental and occupational health. Is it possible to keep the advantages while addressing the disadvantages? And what we've seen in Dharavi is over the years many plans by government to clear it, because it's a very valuable real estate. You're actually just across the road from the new business district in Mumbai. But what the Dharavi residents have done is, with careful political organisation, they fought this. At the moment, fingers crossed, they're being allowed to develop incremental plans where each of the 85 little areas in Mumbai, 85 areas in Dharavi, look to develop an upgrading plan that serves them all, that suits them all. No one is expelled, and everyone keeps their space. And this is a process going on at the moment. You're very welcome to take copies of the presentation, and I've just left some references to where you get more information. So it's funny that businesses use agglomeration economies in cities. Why do businesses invest in cities? Because they've got agglomeration economies of scale and of scope. But there's agglomeration economies for providing water, and providing sanitation, and providing drainage, providing health, providing schools, providing rule of law. And we tend to forget this. And so a compact city like Dharavi provides a basis for a very high living standard if we get the infrastructure and the services in. And a compact city is much preferable to an extended city because the cost of infrastructure is so much lower. If you're thinking of pipes or walkways or concrete, the smaller the length per house served is a critical determinant of total cost. And cities actually have enormous comparative advantages for reducing risks, reducing everyday risks, or reducing traffic accidents. In some of the cities I work in, they have 30 times the death per kilometre mile driven by motor vehicles of Europe. Addressing all the environmental health problems, maternal health problems, child health problems. Cities, when they're well functioning, actually have lower infant and child mortality rates than rural areas. Cities that are well prepared for disasters often provide far more protection for people for cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons than in other places. And you can see, for instance, through Copenhagen, for instance, through what Bloomberg is doing in New York, the possibility of... Sorry about that. It wakes me up at this. You can see the possibility of retaining that high quality. New York's a wonderful city. I want New York to remain a wonderful city, but it can do so while halving or even reducing by 2/3 its greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that interests me, the best bit of my job is I work with slum dwellers. I work with federations of slum dwellers in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And some of the best solutions to improving informal settlements have actually come from them, negotiating with government and working with government. And so one of the city's comparative advantages is that it also provides more scope for social movements to develop. And in the federations I'm talking about, these are savings groups, mainly organised and managed by women, that federate at a city level. And they now exist in 30 nations. In each of those 30 nations, they're beginning to change the way government work in informal settlements. And the transformation is in the relationship of the so-called slum dwellers to the local governments. And it's in changing the nature of that relationship that you get huge possibilities for great advance. And huge possibilities for co-production of water, of sanitation, of schools, of healthcare, even of the rule of law. In Mumbai now, there's an amazing scheme whereby the women's savings groups in informal settlements bring in a couple of police, and between them police the informal settlements. Now, most informal settlements have no policing. And so we have representative organisations and federations of slum shack dwellers. This isn't the community leader who's self-appointed, who's got patron-client relationship with politicians. These are women's savings groups that keep careful records of all the money they save, all the money they get from outside. And the National Slum Dwellers Federation and Mahila Milan is moving together. Between them have 2 million members. 2 million members. Now politicians begin to sit up and take notice. In Thailand, you've got this amazing network of community organisations all over Thailand, engaged in upgrading. In South Africa, you have the South African Federation of the Urban Poor. Federation of the Urban Poor was shrunk to fed up. So the minister found herself negotiating with an organisation that said it was fed up, which produced a certain amount of amusement. In Zimbabwe and Kenya, Zimbabwe is surprising, with the worst national government on the planet, there's phenomenal things that are being done by the federation in Zimbabwe and the local governments, just below the radar of the national political system. Same in Kenya, same in Ghana. In Brazil, it's starting in Sao Paulo. Namibia, they've had nationwide impact on a whole range of things. Malawi, the Philippines, many mayors bring in federation members, even into the accounts committee and the budgetary committee and the land use planning committee, which means that these are beginning to have real representation, real engagement in government. And just as a kind of reminder of these mass movements, and 750,000 savers in 65 cities, and these mostly illiterate women, mostly low-caste women, have designed, built and now manage toilets that probably serve 1.5 million people in Pune and Mumbai. And they've transformed their access to the toilets with the support of local government. That's where the change in relationship is so important. The local government in Mumbai saw these women's savings groups as people they could work with to improve community sanitation, which was disastrous under the municipality. And as that relationship develops, so their ambitions grow, and so their capacities grow. I want to talk about a couple of funds, a couple of ways that you can actually support these sort of grassroots organisations. Grassroots organisations never get money from bilateral agencies, never get money from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. Can we envisage changing the financial system that begins to support the scale that they can achieve as they work closely with local government? And here is a very, very quick organogram of how aid works. You get the aid agency and all the decisions it takes. We're going to prioritise this, we're not going to prioritise that. And it's got an internal structure that has got very few staff, incredible pressure on CEDA, on Dunedin, on the British Aid Programme. Cut your staff, spend money, cut your staff. And the money goes to recipient governments and its priorities, national governments. But then, of course, there's a political process that oversees the aid agency. For reasons that were never clear, CEDA had one of the best urban programs of any bilateral agency that just got chopped by a new minister. you've got commercial interests. I mean, aid agencies, there's lots of money to be made as contractors. And then you've got the development lobbies feeding into them, and you've got the environment lobby, and you've got public opinion and media. And of course, you've got exactly that same thing impacting on the recipient government if the money's going to Cambodia or India or wherever. Powerful commercial interests, lots of money to be made, which maybe goes to local government, which maybe goes to a local contractor, which constructs something, probably without asking those in the neighbourhood whether they wanted it. And the intended beneficiaries, the urban poor, get almost nothing. Now, what is so insane is that these are the people whose needs are legitimated. Aid agencies legitimate themselves on the basis of meeting the needs of rural and urban dwellers. Yet if you look at the way aid is structured, they get very little. What's even worse is they have no accountability. The urban poor there cannot hold any of the people far up the chain to account. And this, to me, is why development assistance has been so ineffective for most of the last 40 years. Couldn't we dream of doing that? Couldn't we dream of just taking a little bit of the $150 billion that goes in development assistance and putting it into a fund for organised urban poor groups, so they get it direct? In 2001, I was phoned by someone who I didn't know, who came from a foundation I didn't know, saying, I want to come and see you. So, okay, why not? And this guy turns up, and we immediately disagree on almost everything. So he said, well, I come from the trust. I said, what trust? Sigurd Grimson Trust. And we are interested in giving grants to community leaders. So I said, well, why to community leaders? That's a crazy thing to do. All you'll do is reinforce the classic patron-client hierarchy. So he said, well, here's a form, fill it in and send it in. So I sent an email around the NGOs that work with the federations and said, what should we do? They said, okay, let's see whether they would fund a fund that we could control and manage ourselves. So I wrote this proposal, 2 pages, sent it off, heard nothing, no acknowledgement, nothing. 8 weeks later, I get an envelope, just a normal envelope with a cheque for £200,000. That's what, 2 million Swedish krona. So we set up, with great incompetence, a fund, but it's a fund that the money comes through my institute, but goes straight to an account that the federations manage collectively. And the federations meet every 6 months and they bring proposals, and they discuss each other's proposals, decide on what it gets, and so they implement. And we got quite steady support over a number of years. And then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put in $50 million. And this is kind of amazing, because this is all funding that is managed and accountable to the federations of slum dwellers. And it's done over 100 initiatives, and I could keep you here till 8 o'clock enthusing about all the initiatives I've been to see that really work, that spend money 10 to 20 times better than anything I've seen through official aid agencies. There's a network, Slum Shack Dwellers International, that is the network that all these federations belong to. And it's that network that actually manages the funds. And there's over 16,000 savings groups. They've built or improved over 200,000 homes. They've probably improved sanitation for 3, 4, 5 billion. Perhaps the most significant thing is that in over 100 cities, there's now real partnerships between the federations and the local government, as they work together, as they recognise each other's capacities. So, for instance, in mapping informal settlements, very difficult for a conventional mapper to do. The federations do the mapping for them, prepare even digital maps to give to the municipal department to design how you put in the infrastructure. And they build toilets, and they build homes, and they produce building materials, they do policing, an amazing range of things. Now, I haven't actually got time to talk about this, but there's also an amazing program, Ideation Coalition for Community Action. And its premise is very simple. in any city, if there's a community organisation that's representative, that wants to try out an initiative, it can get up to $3,000. $3,000. For us, it's an irrelevant word. It's 2 days per diem if you're a World Bank specialist. But this is the first time that these community organisations have had money that they could choose what they would do with it. And I've been to visit not 1,000 sites, but enough sites to see amazing things happening. Because what the Asian Coalition for Community Action also does is, in a city, it will fund 6 or 7 initiatives. It'll bring those initiatives together so they get to know each other, learn from each other, swap ideas. And then collectively, they then go to city government to say, look what we've done in these 7 places. Work with us, and we'll do it in 70 places, in 700 places. And so these $3,000 grants provide the catalyst for something much more fundamental, changing the relationship with local government. What is so surprising is that the funding from Gates stopped, and it was never quite clear why. It certainly wasn't on the basis of any evaluation, because every evaluation of these programs has been sensational. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to do that. We're trying to get money to a fund for organised urban poor groups, which they control and manage. But more than that, it's accountable to them. And it's through this fund for them doing things that they can work with local government, and they can work with local contractors, and even change national government policy. In 4 or 5 nations, national government policy has been changed by the federations. I dream of just 1% of development assistance funding being made available to these. Any of you that want a little more detail on this, I did a TEDx talk on this, which contains a lot more of the stories that I haven't got time to cover now. And I think I'm beginning to come over time. Okay. Sheila Patel, who's been working with the Federation in India for 30 years, made this comment, which is absolutely spot on. The most powerful resource of any poor community is being organised, bringing its own ideas, resources and strategies to the table. So, in a sense, we've got 5 urban agendas. We've got to keep them successful. We've got to reduce poverty. We've got to ensure universal provision of services. We have to build in disaster risk reduction. We have to adapt to climate change, and we have to mitigate climate change. And make it work for the people in Dharavi and the 10,000 other informal settlements where they live. And some of these, it's quite easy to see. There's an enormous overlap between disaster risk reduction and poverty reduction. An awful lot of poverty is unavoidable illnesses, injuries, premature deaths. And as you address those, you usually strengthen a capacity to withstand disasters, extreme events in particular. And climate change adaptation has a lot of overlaps with both of these. You know, if your city is going to survive a hurricane or a typhoon, it needs drains, it needs stormwater drains, it needs sewers, it needs housing built to a standard to withstand extreme weather. You need the political organisation to be able to move when needed. And an awful lot of, as you reduce poverty, so you enormously strengthen the resilience of individuals, households, and communities to climate change adaptation. In a sense, all of these are around addressing local risk. What climate change adaptation does is to provide a future perspective to that risk, whereas disaster risk reduction is usually based on assessing the risks of the past. Okay, I'll skip that. Climate change mitigation is a little bit outside this. You know, there isn't much overlap between climate change adaptation and disaster and climate change mitigation. But the scary thing is that in the end, unless we mitigate climate change, the other 3 areas will become impossible for protecting people from risk. So while there's no immediate overlap between the 2, there is a fundamental overlap between them, because we've got to stop dangerous climate change. If there's dangerous climate change, all the things you do for adaptation aren't going to work. All the things you do for disaster risk reduction aren't going to work. The impacts on low-income groups and their asset base is going to be too strong to manage, to cope with, to be resilient. I'll skip that. I think that's detail that we can look at. So, on the one bit of sustainable development, without compromising the needs of future generations, we have to cut greenhouse gas emissions. They talk a lot about contract and converge for national emissions. You've got to do the same for cities. The high emitting cities have to contract. The low emitting cities, usually the poorest cities, need to improve their economic base, but without vastly increasing emissions. We need a more rigorous accounting procedure. We've got to account on the basis of consumption, otherwise it produces very odd figures, especially for cities. And to get the best out of the cities, look to the Freiburgs, look to the Copenhagens, look to the Porto Alegres, look to the Manizales, look to the Rosarios, for how you can have a development agenda that begins to take clear note of climate change adaptation and mitigation. We've got enough cities showing innovation in this to learn from. And we recognise that most of the sustainable development goals depend on local government and civil society. If you read the sustainable development goals, you'd think that national government did everything. But national government doesn't do everything. National government delegates to local governments water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools, the rule of law, a lot of those. So why isn't the sustainable development goals putting in local government and civil society? Because they're the people that are going to implement it, if they're going to implement it successfully. And where's there been progress? In cities where mayors and city governments are elected. Cities with significant investment capacity. It's very difficult to be a good adapter or a good mitigator if you ain't got any money to invest. And then cities with these amazing innovations by the representative organisations and federations of young chaperones. The whole international system needs to recognise this. Those channels of funding need to go to local governments as well as to civil society. Otherwise, this is what I would recommend for you to build. Because this is architect, design, building to cope with global warming. And you've got a boat for shopping because you're going to be flooded. You have an electric fence to keep out the environmental refugees. You have hydraulic rams that lift your home to cope with rising sea levels, although at some point it's going to run out of stuff. You have tickets for interplanetary travel in case everything else goes wrong. And you have a roof reservoir against drought. This is apparently the Dutch Prime Minister on his way to a meeting, and I use that as my final slide, because at least he seems to get it. My Prime Minister doesn't. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. This was absolutely brilliant, and I think we all feel inspired. At least I do, and I feel like I'm going to jump up and down out of enthusiasm. And I'm sure I've already seen like 5-6 hands in the air during the lecture. So I think we can have a few questions now. But before we go to the Q&A session, I just want to mention that we will be doing more lectures. Sasnet, like I said, organizing more lectures, and we are here to stimulate research in this field.
It's difficult.
So, if any of you would like to write a thesis or do research on this, we are willing to provide some kind of support to you. And I'm not any kind, because we don't have that the wherewithal to help you with all. But we will be there for you to provide some kind of support. And there will be another lecture on the 13th of November at 1:15, the same time as today. And it's a lecture by Ursula Rao, who's an anthropologist, and her lecture is called Global Cities, Local Bodies, and it's a lecture on processes of gentrification, urban upgrading, and the consequences of acute class wars in rapidly growing cities in Delhi, India. Okay, so now we go to the Q&A session, and I will take the questions and then repeat them so that it's clear for everyone. So do we have any questions? I'm sure we have questions. Do you remember your questions that you had during the lecture?
you use the term mitigation. I'm presuming you mean prevention of emissions rather than...
Sorry, I can't hear.
There is a microphone.
I'm trying.
Yeah, turn on the microphone,
It
please.
is on.
Okay.
Okay. When you use the term mitigation, are you meaning prevention of emissions, or are you meaning reduce the impact of the effects of greenhouse gas emissions?
Reduced emissions. Or
Just reduce.
reduce climate change drivers, which include mostly emissions.
Okay, because in some terminology, mitigation just means prevent at all costs. In others, it just means reduce the impact of. So I was wondering which one you were using there.
Yeah, but there's also risk people are very cross with the IPCC because they want mitigation to mean something different.
Okay. Göran?
Just a small thing, I was a little surprised as to one of the final remarks about the role of communities, because it made me think of the Rio Agenda, which had a very clear thrust towards managing environment on the local level. Are you saying that that's been lost on the way, or I remember Lund here, there were booths in the square where activists were pleading for local initiatives along the Rio Agenda, and I think it's come to nothing more.
So did you get that question?
Yes.
Maybe we should repeat the question.
You know, I'm not even sure I got the. It seemed more like a statement, Jan, but could you just quickly repeat it for me, please?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd
and yeah,
like
he's,
to rephrase it. I was a little surprised when you said that all the big organizations are ignoring the local level initiatives. Because I came to think of the Rio Agenda, which had as one of its main thrusts was exactly to stimulate local level action when it comes to environmental. At that time, they were not talking about the same issues in terms of environment, but they were really locating the responsibility at local level. And it seems you imply that that's been lost on the way because you say nobody is interested to take. Is that how we should take it?
okay, so the question is, did that focus on local governance, did it get lost since 1992 till now, or have we lost that focus? I guess this is the Rio Agreement on Sustainable Development.
Do you want to answer question by question, or do you want to take 2 or 3?
I think, do we have, well, why don't we take 2 more questions before we proceed? So yes, Leonard.
You showed the pictures from Dharavi. So do you have any ideas why, I mean, they are so successful in organizing various small-scale businesses. Why is it so hard to organize as effectively fundamental infrastructure for water and sanitation?
Okay. So 3rd question. Yes. Okay, and then we have the 4th. We'll take you the next round.
Actually, I have a related that question which you just had up there, sir. Because you showed the picture about that. You mentioned that it's quite good that they recycle everything and try and reuse, but however, the water was contaminated in those streams. So isn't behind a stigma maybe to clean up those water areas?
Okay. Okay. So I'll give the word to you, David. You can, and then we take another round, if that's all right.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I come to you, Zach?
Yes.
On the issue of local governments, the United Nations functions with national delegations, representing national ministries or the representatives they keep in New York, and they make commitments as they made commitments with the Millennium Development Goals. But those commitments usually fall to local government. Local governments are not represented in government delegations. And there's almost no discussion. In a sense, you've got the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to eliminate poverty. We're going to make everyone happy. We're going to give everyone social provision, water and sanitation and drainage and healthcare and schools, the rule of law. But it doesn't mention local government. And it doesn't mention the decentralization of revenue powers and resources that are needed to allow local government to take those responsibilities. And civil society is completely out. So, to me, the two critical players in reducing poverty, local government, civil society, are the ones that get no support with these international declarations. And I would actually like cities, or at least an alliance of democratically elected mayors, to say we have the right to make our own goals and our own targets collectively and to monitor our own work. And that falls within the responsibilities we have to the citizens that elected us. And I think that would change completely the kind of discourse. As those form, so bilateral agencies will begin to think of ways of working with local government direct, rather than always with and through national government. On the second and third question, it's always difficult to get diverse, busy people to agree to collective action. In a few places it's happened, but if you go down a street in Dharavi, you'll have young migrants that have just arrived who are paying to sleep in the bed by the hour. And you'll have more consolidated migrants that are living with their whole family in one house. And then the people downstairs are the landlords, and the people next door are making the pots, and then the people next door are running service provision. And it's because you can't negotiate well with local government to get investments in Dharavi, you don't do the sort of collective action that will provide that basis. And it's too difficult to do individually. 400,000 people in 2 square kilometers needs a phenomenal technical competence to squeeze in the water pipes and the sewers and the drains so that they service everything. The only kind of collective action that's worked well in Dharavi has been some community toilets. And that's because they're relatively simple in technological terms to design, build, manage and fund.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we have 2 more questions. We'll begin with you, because you lost out in the first round. So you first, and then you, and then Lubna. Okay.
Thank you. How valuable is Copenhagen's climate balance if Scandinavia's biggest airport is directly across the street and is used like that? And how do you, as a professional, in your professional scientist's role, contribute to mitigation of climate change?
Okay, that was a pretty clear question, or two the A and B questions. Okay, so next question. Yes.
Yeah, I really liked the presentation. It was very excellent, and especially pointing out the Global South example. That was very much needed, and it's very much in line with the discussing in human ecology. What I wanted to ask you about is, since Habitat for is coming up in 2016, it's going to be the first major discussion that happens in the Habitat Conference. It'll be post-2015, after the SDGs has been introduced. And I was wondering, since that is trying to talk to the cities level, if you have any sense about what kind of power the mayors or the local representatives might be able to have, particularly since they're going to be feeding off of what comes out of the post-2015 SDGs agenda. And it's also coming off of the Medellin declaration on cities that just happened earlier this year, and trying to see, is this actually something that is possible to raise the city's agenda, or if you think that is not, if they're going to be constrained by the national agreements that are coming into effect because of the SDGs. So, yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. So, Lubnas, we take the third question before the next round of answers. So, Lubna, please. Third question.
Yes, I come from the Maldives, and My question is related to the urbanization phenomena in the small island countries or societies or economies, because we have witnessed a rapid urbanization in the Pacific Islands and also in Maldives, where the capital island right now has over 200,000 people living in a 5 square kilometer space. So I know a thing or two about compact lifestyle. So my question to you is that is there a need, or should we be looking at the urbanization phenomena and adaptation to climate change risks specifically within this form of geographical settings? Because I believe the opportunities and the challenges within these form of communities may be different compared to, for example, other larger countries or economies.
Cities always try to avoid including airports in their greenhouse gas emission inventories. And London tries hard to ignore the fact that Heathrow is actually in the Greater London Authority area. But they managed to get rid of Gatwick and Stansted because they were outside, even though almost everyone using them either comes to London or goes from London. The real issue with airports is actually the people who should be penalised are the people using the airport, not the airport. So it shouldn't go to Copenhagen. It should go to the people using Copenhagen Airport to be penalised for their greenhouse gas emissions. And if we end up with this idea that there's a carbon trading system that happens between individuals and households, that would remove the problem of airports being allocated to particular cities. How do I contribute to mitigation? I try to travel as little as possible, and everyone in my institute tracks their own global footprint, and we're pretty good, except in international flights. And it's difficult to know how you manage a global institution with very strong working relationships all over Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In part, you move to Skype, which is very valuable, but it's not the same, especially as one of the ways we work with our collaborators is to bring in a lot of young people and get them engaged. And so every discussion of our work also becomes a seminar for younger people. And I don't know how we reconcile that. We're investing more in communication systems that allow us to have less and less travel for our meetings, but we seem to have reached a kind of limit, and that means that as an institute we do have a high greenhouse gas emission index. I was actually, I cut my teeth at Habitat 1, the first UN conference in 1976. I ended up organising the NGO forum there. And the Canadian government gave us $1.5 million, which maybe were $10 million now. So we had a custom-made site. We could accommodate 25,000 civil society representatives. And we were allowed to invite everyone we wanted. And so we had this amazing list of the top speakers, grassroots leaders, academics, activists. And it was a hugely successful conference. And the government delegations visited the NGO conference and so on and so on and so on. But here we are now, less than 2 years before Habitat 3 is to be organised. And we don't even know which city it's going to be in. And frankly, UN Habitat is very low in the UN pecking order of credibility because they publish a lot of material that is very suspect. There's a famous case of the world lost 200 million slum dwellers between 2000 and 2010. And UN Habitat were very proud of this, and they issued a report saying, we've met the Millennium Development Goal, we've had great success. And 60 million of that was in India. I happened to be in India, and I don't usually consult with ministers, but I was with the Minister of Poverty Reduction. I said, do you know about these 60 million people that have moved out of slums in India? She said, no. So I said, well, the UN's quoting this figure. So she called all her civil servants, and none of them knew. And as we began to dig deeper, what had happened? UN Habitat had changed the criteria for sanitation and made it a lower standard as acceptable, and that had moved 200 million people from one category to another. So no one had moved out of slum. They'd just done it with statistical manipulation. And you know, this is the agency that's got to lead us to what I'm hoping is you've got strong networks. You've got ICLEI, which combine a lot of good mayors on climate change. You've got C40 that brings in the big fellas, the big cities. You've got United Cities and Local Governments that is a very good network with regional networks of mayors and city governments. And if those three can work together with UN Habitat and make this a celebration of what democratic city government can achieve and who are the key players, then it would be great. I think that would enormously support this whole process. But then there's all the kind of interinstitutional rivalries to be overcome before we can do that. On the questions from the Maldives, it's always impossible to really answer, given the impossible situation that Maldives faces. But I have seen what a community-generated, community-responsive force can bring to urbanisation, to make it work. I've watched Dharavi work better and better every year I go, because a little bit more is being done to it. And very community-driven, very accountable, very transparent, incremental upgrading with the support from external groups to make sure the infrastructure works is a model that we need to promote. I don't think there's much more I can say.
It was more general to the island economies.
More general to the
island economies, because this urbanization is happening even in the Pacific Islands with South Tarawa and Apia and Vanuatu.
Yeah. But how is it going to prevent itself from sea level rise? I'm sure you all know Maldives is absolutely fundamentally threatened by sea level rise generated by forces to which they contributed nothing. It's a really shocking example. And in a sense, it's one of the first examples that will go. But as we fail to reduce emissions globally, so more and more countries will reach the level of danger and finally destruction of Maldives.
Thank you very much, David.